The humid September air hung heavy over Busan as Officer Kim Tae-ho walked his patrol route through the crowded streets. Thousands of people filled every corner of the city. They had run away from Seoul when the North Korean army came south in June. Now Busan was the only safe place left in South Korea. Kim Tae-ho wiped sweat from his forehead. He was tired and angry. The war had changed everything. His own family had lost their home in Seoul. His brother was missing somewhere up north. Every day brought more bad news from the fighting. The street smelled of cooking rice and unwashed bodies. Families sat on sidewalks with all their belongings in small bundles. Children cried from hunger. Old people stared at nothing with empty eyes. Kim Tae-ho felt sorry for them, but he also felt frustrated. There were too many people and not enough food or space. Near the military checkpoint, he saw something that made him stop. A black woman walked alone toward the UN headquarters building. She wore a clean dress and carried a leather briefcase. Her clothes looked expensive compared to what everyone else wore. Kim Tae-ho had never seen a black person before the Americans came. The few he had seen were soldiers, but this woman looked different. She walked with confidence like someone important. This made him suspicious. He followed her for a few minutes. She stopped at the checkpoint and showed papers to the American guard. The guard smiled and waved her through. This made Kim Tae-ho even more curious. Who was this woman? Why did the Americans treat her so well? After she passed through, Kim Tae-ho walked up to the American guard. "Who was that woman?" he asked in his broken English. The guard shrugged. "Some translator lady. Works with the UN command." Kim Tae-ho felt anger rise in his chest. A translator? He could not believe it. In Korea, important jobs like translator went to educated Korean men or American officers, not to black women. The Americans must be lying about something. Later, that evening, Kim Tae-ho saw the same woman walking back from the headquarters. She looked very tired. Her clothes were wrinkled and her briefcase looked heavy. She walked slowly like someone who had worked all day. This was his chance to find out the truth. Kim Tae-ho stepped out of the shadows and blocked her path. "Stop," he said in English. "Show me your papers." Lee Mi-sun looked up at the Korean police officer. She was exhausted after 16 hours of translating important military documents. Chinese forces were moving south. The UN command needed to know everything about enemy positions and plans. Every word she translated could save lives or lose battles. "Officer, I have already shown my credentials at the checkpoint," she said politely. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out her official UN identification card and translator license. Kim Tae-ho looked at the papers, but could not read the English words very well. The official stamps looked real, but he still did not believe it. How could a black woman have such an important job? In his mind, it made no sense. "These papers are fake," he said roughly. "You are a spy. Where did you steal these?" Lee Mi-sun stayed calm even though she felt angry and hurt. She had dealt with prejudice before, both in America and in other countries. But here in Korea, during a war where she was trying to help save lives, it felt especially cruel. "Officer, please contact the UN command. They will confirm my identity. I am Chief Legal Translator Lee Mi-sun. I work directly with Colonel Peterson on prisoner documentation." But Kim Tae-ho was not listening. In his mind, he had already decided she was lying. Maybe she was a North Korean spy. Maybe she was an American criminal hiding in Korea. Whatever the truth was, he was sure she did not belong here. "You come with me now," he said, grabbing her arm. "We go to police station." Lee Mi-sun tried to pull away. "Officer, you're making a mistake. I must return to headquarters. There are urgent documents that need translation tonight. Lives depend on this work." Kim Tae-ho ignored her protests. He was convinced he had caught someone dangerous. In his mind, he was protecting Korea from enemies. He did not think about how his prejudice was clouding his judgment. He did not consider that his actions might hurt the war effort. As he forced her toward the police station, Lee Mi-sun realized this was going to be a long night. She knew that, somewhere in the UN command headquarters, important military leaders were waiting for her translations. Maps showing enemy positions sat untranslated on desks. Radio messages from Chinese commanders remained unread. The war would not wait for her to clear up this misunderstanding. While she sat in a police cell because of one man's prejudice, the Battle for Korea's survival continued without her expertise. Kim Tae-ho felt proud as he pushed her into the police station. He thought he had done something good for his country. He had no idea that he had just arrested one of the most important people working to save South Korea from defeat. Colonel Park. Dong-min looked at his watch for the 5th time in 10 minutes. It was past midnight, and Lee Mi-sun had not returned from her break. This was very unusual. She never missed deadlines, especially during important operations like tonight. On his desk sat a pile of captured Chinese documents that needed immediate translation. Radio messages from enemy commanders, battle plans, and supply routes, all written in Chinese characters that only Mi-sun could read quickly and accurately. Without her translations, the UN forces would be fighting blind tomorrow. Park had worked with many translators during his military career, but none were like Mi-sun. She could listen to a Chinese radio broadcast and translate it into perfect English while taking notes in Korean. Her legal training helped her understand the complex military and political language that confused other translators. The colonel walked to the communications room, where Sergeant Kim Bong-soo was monitoring radio traffic. "Have you seen Miss Lee tonight?" Park asked. "No, sir. She left around 6 o'clock, said she was going to get some food and would be back in an hour." Park felt worry growing in his stomach. Mi-sun was dedicated to her work. She often forgot to eat when important documents needed translation. For her to disappear during such a critical night meant something was wrong. "Get me Lieutenant Johnson from the military police," Park ordered. Within minutes, Lieutenant Johnson arrived at headquarters. He was a tall American officer who handled security for the UN command. Park explained the situation quickly. "Colonel, are you sure she didn't just go back to her quarters to rest?" Johnson asked. "Impossible," Park replied firmly. "She has been working on Chinese intelligence reports all week. Tonight we intercepted enemy communications about a major attack planned for tomorrow. She knows lives depend on these translations." Johnson could see the worry in Park's eyes. In the few months since the UN command was established, Lee Mi-sun had become essential to their operations. Her ability to translate legal documents, military orders, and diplomatic messages made her one of their most valuable team members. "I'll organize a search immediately," Johnson said. "Where did she usually go for food?" Park pointed toward the refugee area near the docks. "There are small restaurants there that stay open late. She liked the quiet ones where she could think." Johnson gathered a team of military police and Korean officers. They split up to cover different areas of Busan. The city was still busy even at midnight. Refugees who could not sleep wandered the streets. Soldiers moved supplies and equipment. Street vendors sold food to anyone with money. After 2 hours of searching, Corporal Lee Jae-min radioed back to headquarters. "Sir, I found something. The owner of a noodle shop says he saw a Korean police officer arrest a black woman around 8 o'clock. They went toward the central police station." Johnson felt his heart sink. A Korean police officer arresting an American civilian could create serious problems between the UN command and local authorities. If that civilian was Lee Mi-sun, it could damage military operations. He drove quickly to the police station with Park and 2 other officers. The building was old and poorly lit. Inside, they found Captain Yoon Jae-sung working late at his desk. "Captain, we are looking for an American woman who may have been brought here tonight," Johnson said through an interpreter. Captain Yoon looked confused. "American woman? We have not arrested any Americans. That would require special permission from your command." "She is a black woman, about 30 years old, wearing a dark dress and carrying a briefcase," Park added in Korean. Yoon's face changed. He suddenly looked worried. "Oh no, Officer Kim brought in a woman matching that description, but he said she was a spy with fake documents." Johnson and Park exchanged glances. They both knew what had happened. Kim Tae-ho had made a terrible mistake based on his prejudice and ignorance. "Captain, that woman is Lee Mi-sun, Chief Legal Advisor for the UN Command War Crimes Documentation Unit," Park said slowly and clearly. "She has top-level security clearance and works directly with our senior commanders." Captain Yoon's face went pale. In Korean culture, making such a serious mistake brought great shame. But more importantly, he realized that his officer had potentially damaged South Korea's relationship with its most important ally. Where is she now? Johnson demanded. In holding cell number 3. Officer Kim is writing his report. They hurried to the cell area. Through the bars, they saw Lee Mi-sun sitting calmly on a wooden bench. Her briefcase sat beside her, and she was reviewing some papers by the dim light from the hallway. When she saw Colonel Park, she stood up with a tired smile. "Colonel, I was wondering when you would find me. I hope someone is translating those Chinese documents." Park felt both relief and anger. Relief that she was safe, and anger at the stupidity that had put her here. "Mi-sun, I am so sorry this happened. We will have you out immediately." As Captain Yoon unlocked the cell, Johnson was already thinking about the consequences. Kim Tae-ho had arrested someone whose work was crucial to the war effort. His prejudice had potentially cost lives and damaged international cooperation. Lee Mi-sun walked out of the cell with dignity intact. She had spent 4 hours in jail, but her first concern was still the untranslated documents waiting at headquarters. Captain Yoon Jae-sung stared at the scene before him in disbelief. In his small office sat the most important people in Busan. Colonel Park from the UN Command, Lieutenant Johnson from the American Military Police, and several other high-ranking officers. They all looked very angry. In the corner stood Officer Kim Tae-ho, still holding his arrest report. He looked confused and defensive. He did not understand why everyone was so upset about arresting one woman. "Captain Yoon," Colonel Park said in perfect Korean, "do you realize what your officer has done?" Yoon felt sweat on his forehead despite the cool evening air. "Sir, I'm still trying to understand the situation." Lee Mi-sun sat quietly in a chair, her briefcase on her lap. Despite spending 4 hours in a dirty jail cell, she looked calm and professional. Her dress was wrinkled and her hair was messy, but her eyes were alert and intelligent. "Perhaps I should explain," she said in fluent Korean. Everyone in the room turned to look at her in surprise. Kim Tae-ho's mouth fell open. He had assumed she could not speak Korean. "My name is Lee Mi-sun. I am the Chief Legal Advisor for the UN Command War Crimes Documentation Unit. I speak Korean, Chinese, English, and Japanese. I have been working 16-hour days since July to help save South Korea from invasion." Kim Tae-ho felt the blood drain from his face. His confident attitude began to crumble. Lee Mi-sun continued speaking in a calm, clear voice. "Today I finished translating captured documents that show Chinese forces planning a major attack on Busan. I also completed legal reports about North Korean treatment of prisoners. This information will go to the United Nations in New York to maintain international support for defending South Korea." Captain Yoon realized the full scope of the disaster. This woman was not just any translator. She was someone whose work directly affected whether South Korea would survive as a nation. "Officer Kim," Yoon said sharply, "explain to me exactly what happened." Kim Tae-ho straightened his uniform and tried to sound confident. "Captain, I saw this woman walking alone near the military area. She looked suspicious. When I asked for identification, she showed me papers that seemed fake. I believed she might be a spy." "What made the papers seem fake?" Lieutenant Johnson asked through an interpreter. Kim Tae-ho hesitated. The truth was embarrassing. "Well, I could not read the English very well, and I thought, it seemed unlikely that someone like her would have such an important job." The room fell silent. Everyone understood what he meant by someone like her. Lee Mi-sun spoke again, still maintaining her calm tone. "Officer Kim, you arrested me because I am a black woman. You could not believe that a black woman could be intelligent enough or important enough to work with military commanders." Kim Tae-ho wanted to deny it, but the words stuck in his throat. Deep down he knew she was right. Colonel Park stood up, his face red with anger. "Officer Kim, while you kept Miss Lee in jail, Chinese forces moved closer to Busan. The documents she was supposed to translate tonight contained information about enemy supply routes and attack plans. Because of your prejudice, our forces will go into battle tomorrow without critical intelligence." The weight of his mistake began to crush Kim Tae-ho. He had always thought of himself as a patriot, someone who protected Korea. Now he realized his actions might have helped the enemy. Captain Yoon felt ashamed of his subordinate and angry at the situation. Korea was fighting for its life against invasion. They needed help from the United Nations, and especially from America. Insulting and arresting an important American official could damage that relationship. Miss Lee, Yoon said formally, on behalf of the Korean National Police, I apologize deeply for this terrible mistake. Officer Kim will face serious consequences for his actions. Lee Mi-sun looked at Kim Tae-ho for a long moment. He could not meet her eyes. She saw a young man who had been raised with certain beliefs about race and power. The war had put him in contact with people different from himself, and he had reacted with fear and prejudice instead of openness. Captain Yoon, I do not want to destroy Officer Kim's career, she said quietly. But this incident shows a serious problem. Korean police officers work closely with UN personnel from many different countries. If they cannot treat all UN staff with respect, it will hurt our cooperation. Lieutenant Johnson nodded. Miss Lee is right. We have soldiers and civilians from 16 different nations working together in Korea. British, Turkish, Ethiopian, Filipino, Thai, people of many races and cultures. If Korean police cannot work with all of them equally, it creates problems for everyone. Kim Tae-ho finally understood the bigger picture. Korea was not just fighting North Korea. It was learning to be part of an international community. His prejudice had not just hurt one woman, it had damaged Korea's reputation with the world. Lee Mi-sun stood up and picked up her briefcase. Gentlemen, I need to return to headquarters. Those Chinese documents will not translate themselves as... She walked toward the door. She paused and looked back at Kim Tae-ho. Officer Kim, prejudice is like a disease. It blinds us to truth and makes us hurt innocent people. In wartime, it can cost lives. I hope you will think about that. 3 weeks after the arrest incident, Lee Mi-sun sat in a meeting room at UN Command Headquarters with Colonel Park and 5 other officers. On the table were reports from Korean police stations across Busan. The reports showed more problems between Korean officers and international UN personnel. Yesterday, a Turkish medical officer was detained for 2 hours because a Korean policeman did not believe his credentials. Colonel Park read from one report. Last week, Ethiopian soldiers were refused entry to a supply depot despite having proper orders. Lee Mi-sun listened carefully as Park continued reading. Each report showed the same pattern. Korean police officers who could not accept that people who looked different from them could hold important positions in the war effort. The problem is getting worse as more international forces arrive, said Major Williams, the American liaison officer. We have soldiers and civilians from 16 different countries now. If Korean police keep treating them with suspicion, it will hurt our ability to fight together. Lee Mi-sun had spent the past 3 weeks thinking about her arrest. At first, she felt angry and hurt, but then she realized something important. Kim Tae-ho was not evil, he was ignorant. His prejudice came from never meeting people different, from himself, and believing stereotypes instead of facts. Gentlemen, she said, I propose we create a training program for Korean police officers. Instead of punishing them after they make mistakes, we should teach them before problems happen. Colonel Park looked interested. What kind of training? Lee Mi-sun opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. She had been working on this idea during her spare time. First, Korean officers need to learn about the different countries fighting with us. Most have never met people from Turkey, Ethiopia, the Philippines, or Thailand. They do not understand these cultures. She spread several papers on the table. Second, they need to see examples of identification documents from different nations. Many Korean officers cannot read English well enough to recognize real UN credentials. Major Williams picked up one of the papers. It showed photographs of military badges, ID cards, and uniforms from various UN countries. This is excellent work, Miss Lee. How long did this take you to prepare? I worked on it every evening after finishing my regular translation duties, she replied. I also interviewed officers from different countries to understand what problems they face with Korean police. Colonel Park was impressed by her thoroughness. Instead of seeking revenge against Kim Tae-ho, she had turned her bad experience into something that could help everyone. There is one more important part, Lee Mi-sun continued. Korean officers need to understand why we are all here. We are not invaders or tourists. We came to help save South Korea from being conquered. Every person wearing a UN uniform, no matter what color their skin is, chose to risk their life for Korean freedom. The room fell quiet as the officers absorbed her words. She was right. Soldiers from around the world had left their families and homes to fight in Korea. They deserved respect, not suspicion. "I will speak with Captain Yoon about implementing this training immediately," Colonel Park said. "What about Officer Kim Tae-ho? He is scheduled for court-martial next week." Lee Mi-sun had thought about this carefully. Kim Tae-ho's actions had interfered with military operations during wartime, which was a serious crime. But she also believed people could change if given the chance. "I recommend he receive punishment, but also an opportunity to learn," she said. "Make him attend every training session. Make him work with international personnel under supervision. If he shows he can change his attitudes, then perhaps he can earn back his position." Major Williams nodded approvingly. "Restorative justice rather than just punishment. It fits with our goals of building cooperation." Over the following weeks, Lee Mi-sun's training program began at police stations throughout Busan. Korean officers learned about different cultures, practiced reading international documents, and heard presentations from UN personnel from various countries. The results were immediate and positive. A British medical team reported that Korean police helped them efficiently when they arrived at a checkpoint. Turkish engineers praised the cooperation they received when setting up communications equipment. Ethiopian pilots found Korean guards who could properly verify their flight credentials. Kim Tae-ho attended every training session as ordered by the court-martial board. At first he sat quietly in the back, still defensive about his actions. But gradually he began to ask questions and participate in discussions. During one session, a Filipino nurse named Rosa Santos spoke about leaving her family to serve in Korea. She showed photographs of her children and explained how she missed them every day but felt proud to help wounded soldiers. After her presentation, Kim Tae-ho approached her. "Miss Santos, I want to apologize. Before this training, I would have looked at you and seen only someone who was different. Now I understand you are here to save Korean lives." Rosa smiled and shook his hand. "Thank you, Officer Kim. We are all learning to work together." By November, Lee Mi-sun's program had expanded to other cities where UN forces operated. Korean and international personnel began to see each other as partners rather than strangers. The improved cooperation made military operations more efficient and reduced tensions that could have damaged the war effort. Lee Mi-sun continued her translation work, but she also became known throughout the UN command as someone who could solve problems between different groups. Her experience of being wrongly arrested had been transformed into something that helped thousands of people work together more effectively. Colonel Park often told other officers, "Miss Lee turned prejudice into progress. That is the kind of leadership we need to win this war." The morning of July 27, 1953, was hot and humid in Panmunjom. Lee Mi-sun sat at a long wooden table inside a simple building that had become the center of world attention. Around her sat generals, diplomats, and translators from China, North Korea, South Korea, and the United Nations Command. After 3 years of war, they were finally ready to sign papers that would stop the fighting. But these were not simple papers. Every word had been argued over for months. Every sentence could affect the lives of millions of people. Lee Mi-sun held a thick folder containing the final version of the Korean Armistice Agreement. She had translated and reviewed every page multiple times. Her job was to make sure that all versions, English, Korean, and Chinese, said exactly the same thing. "Miss Lee," said General Harrison, the chief UN negotiator, "are you satisfied that Article 3 accurately describes the prisoner exchange procedures?" Lee Mi-sun opened to the correct page and read carefully. This section was especially important to her. During the war, she had documented how prisoners were treated by both sides. She had interviewed captured soldiers and civilians. She knew that getting this part right could save thousands of lives. "General, the English and Korean versions match perfectly," she replied. "The Chinese version has one small difference in paragraph 4. They use a phrase that could be interpreted as voluntary return or forced return. We should clarify this before signing." The Chinese translator, Colonel Chen Wei-ming, looked embarrassed. He had worked with Li Mi-sun many times during the negotiations. At first, he had been surprised that the Americans sent a black woman to handle such important legal work. But after months of working together, he had great respect for her accuracy and fairness. "Miss Li is correct," he admitted. "We should change the Chinese phrase to match the English meaning exactly." General Nam-il, the North Korean representative, looked impatient. "These small word changes are not important. We have been talking for 2 years. It is time to sign and end this war." Li Mi-sun spoke carefully but firmly. "General Nam, small words can have big consequences. When we say prisoners can choose whether to return home, it must mean the same thing in all languages. Otherwise, we will have arguments later about what we agreed to." She had learned this lesson during her 3 years of war work. Misunderstandings between different countries often started with unclear language. One word, translated incorrectly, could cause months of problems. Colonel Park Dong-min, now a general himself, nodded approvingly. He had watched Li Mi-sun grow from a talented translator into one of the most respected legal experts in the UN command. "Miss Li is right. We must be precise now to avoid conflicts later." As the translators made the final corrections, Li Mi-sun thought about how much had changed since that night in September 1950, when Kim Tae-ho arrested her. That incident had seemed like a disaster at the time, but it had led to important improvements in how different countries work together. Through the window, she could see Kim Tae-ho standing with other administrative staff outside the building. He wore the uniform of a clerk, not a police officer. The court-martial had ended his career in law enforcement, but he had found new purpose in supporting the peace negotiations. During the long months of talks at Panmunjom, Kim Tae-ho had worked quietly in the background, filing documents and organizing meetings. He had also continued attending cultural training sessions, learning about the different countries involved in the Korean conflict. Last week, he had approached Li Mi-sun during a break in the negotiations. "Miss Li," he said quietly, "I want to thank you for recommending mercy during my trial. These 3 years have taught me things I never knew about the world." She had smiled at him. "Mr. Kim, we all learned things during this war. The important thing is that we use those lessons to build something better." Now, as the final signatures were added to the armistice agreement, Li Mi-sun felt proud of what they had accomplished. The document they created would establish the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea. It would set up procedures for prisoner exchanges. It would create mechanisms for the two sides to communicate without fighting. But more than that, the process of creating the agreement had shown that people from very different backgrounds could work together on difficult problems. Chinese, Korean, American, British, Turkish, and other nationalities had sat at the same tables, argued respectfully, and found solutions. General Harrison stood up as the last signature was completed. "Ladies and gentlemen, the Korean War fighting will officially end in 12 hours. This armistice agreement represents the hard work of thousands of people from many nations." He looked directly at Li Mi-sun. "I want to especially thank those who showed us that diversity of thought and experience makes us stronger, not weaker. The legal framework we created here will serve as a model for international cooperation for many years to come." As people began to leave the building, Li Mi-sun packed her folders carefully. Tomorrow she would return to America, but she knew that her work in Korea had changed her forever. She had helped prove that prejudice could be overcome, that people could learn to respect each other, and that lasting peace required the wisdom of many different voices working together. Outside, Kim Tae-ho was helping load documents into trucks. When he saw her, he bowed respectfully. It was a gesture of recognition, not just of her rank, but of the lessons they had both learned about judging people by their character rather than their appearance.